1.
So this video we're going to talk very briefly about an introduction to functions. You may have heard that word spoken a few times, but we're going to go to the very basics here and talk about the definition. We're going to talk about function notation and just a few of the details here in practice evaluating functions. All right, so let's just dive right in. First of all, the definition of a function. Each x, or what we want to call an input, has one and only one y, which we call an output. Okay, so I want you to start thinking about when we're talking about functions, you need to start visualizing graphs of functions that you've done in the past, like lines and things like that on your coordinate plane. Okay, so when we're talking about functions, you're going to be trying to represent them using your graphs. You're going to be using tables, and you're going to be using equations and what we call function rules. Okay, remember your function rules, they have the numbers and the variables, the plus signs, the minus signs, and all that fun stuff. Okay, so we're going to be looking at different representations of functions, but the definition of a function is going to remain the same. For each x, or your input value, there is one and only one y value or output value. Okay, so you'll notice I'm putting all of these terminologies, a couple different representations for everything so that we can get them ingrained in our brains, okay? All right, so when we start talking about function notation, okay, if you talk to any mathematician, which you are all mathematicians now, function notation is universal. Okay, so what you're going to see, if you've ever seen that F with a parentheses X inside of it, that's function notation. And what that means is it's the function of the input of X. So what are the rules around and what happens when you input different variables of x into a particular function rule? Okay, so this f with the parentheses of x is usually followed by an equal sign and then an equation or a math problem. All right, and each one is unique and different, and so that's why you call it a function of x. You put in this x, well, for each rule, you're going to get a different y value or output. And we're going to practice that here in a minute. Let me not get too far ahead of myself here. Okay, so that's what it means when you read it out loud. If you actually read this, most mathematicians are a little lazy when it comes to the written language. So we just say f of x. Okay, we shorten all this down. The function of the input of x, that's going to take a long time to say a lot if we have to repeat ourselves. So most of the time we just say f of x. Now f of x equals y. All right, so your input may be the x, but your output is always going to be your y. So f of x equals y. And a lot of times you can replace that f parentheses around the x with the y value, and it means the same thing. All right, so x is the input value. That means that's the value that you're going to put into an equation to try to find what your y is going to equal. Okay, and I know some of this you might be looking at this going, what is this woman talking about? It's going to make a lot of sense as we continue going, but I wanted to give you the background and the definitions first. All right, so when you input an x, you output a y. And it's going to give you a coordinate, an XY coordinate. And where do we use those coordinates? Well, we use those to plot graphs. Okay, so that's how this function thing works. You input an X, you output a Y, and it gives you a coordinate that you can actually plot on a graph. Now, how do you evaluate a function? It's really rather simple. So let's say we have the function rule f of x equals 2x plus 5. All right, and let's say you're asked to evaluate f of 4. So you'll notice that 4 has replaced the x variable. That means that we are inputting 4. We want to know what is the y value when we put in 4 for x. So input a 4, and we want to output a y. We want to get something out of it. So how do you work that out? I've worked out the steps here for you. So f of 4 equals 2 times 4 plus 5. You'll notice I replaced the x value with that 4. Okay, I inputted the 4 into the actual function rule. So 2 times 4, what does that equal? That's 8. What's 8 plus 5? That's 13. And what do we end up with? We end up with a coordinate for 13. All right, now let's talk just a minute about domain and range. Domain is all possible x values of a function, okay? And we're going to talk and go into depth and do examples with domain in class, but for now, I just want you to focus on this definition. Domain is all possible x values, and I'm hoping this is a little bit of a review, but those are your input values, okay? And then range is going to be all possible y values or your output values. All right, so if you need to go back through and watch this video again, make sure you've got good notes. I've tried to keep things very basic and I've given you an example or so. Make sure you've got some good notes on these things because you're going to want to refer back to them later.